So how are we doing this? Next slide, please. Leverage existing investments. So I talked about these different systems, RAS, Seed, Microbes Online, and so on. And when we started this recent project, we were really thinking hard about how we could leverage. We didn't want to re-implement all of these tools. And initially, we started out with the idea that we would create some kind of federation with these tools. We'd ask each group to expose services via some kind of services interface, expose their data. We then would layer on top of that a set of services that would integrate data, reconcile IDs, and so forth. And that turned out to be ultimately not what we decided to do. Just to give you a sense of how these things are integrated. Next slide, please. This is a workflow. I walked you through conceptually that microbial demo earlier. This is the actual, or a more detailed, I should say it that way, it's even more complicated than this, but a more detailed blow-up of how the data is flowing between these systems. And on this diagram, you can see that the red boxes essentially are computational steps with specific algorithms. The purple data is user input, and you can see like a genome or growth data or structured expression data or so forth. And then you can see this blue is a list of different systems that implement these different components. And so the challenge that we faced was, how do we integrate the flow of data between these different systems? And the simple kind of federation model we came up with really was not very efficient at doing this, because you're often passing significant amounts of structured data between systems, and we wanted that to be much more efficient. So this was our original. Next slide, please. This was an original sort of architectural stack that we were building. That is, it had services on the bottom, a set of exposed APIs, and then an application platform that sort of could be run across those APIs, and then a unified programming environment on top of that for writing new applications. And while this is still what we're doing conceptually at some level, the implementation is a little bit different. What we decided was that we needed to have even early on, that we had to have some caching of data in between the systems to make this efficient. And over time, we decided that since we had to do all the work to build what amounted to multiple storage environments to handle these caches, that it was only a slight step further to actually build an integrated data model for the system. So KBase actually has 3 types of stores. And going from the right to the left, the central data model is a relational store that represents the very tight integration of the public data. The middle store, what we call the persistent store, is for user data. The middle one is based on NoSQL technology, like MongoDB, for example, that allows users to upload data and to snapshot their workflows and to handle structured workflow handoffs between components. And then the system on the left is a bulk environment, and this is where we put very large amounts of data. For example, the raw reads in a metagenomics study that might be as large as a terabyte of data per study. You wouldn't want to integrate that into a relational form because usually you only ingest those reads once, process them to produce downstream data products, and you never really go back to them very often. So we have a bulk file store that's managed with another layer on top of it. So these 3 stores make up the sort of data environment on which KBase is built. And what we did, next slide please, is we took these core services and then mapped them into these stores. And so the data model of the underlying existing services for public data got mapped into the central data store, and the integration is actually done there. So we upload data from each of these services into that integrated sense, into that integrated store. And some of these services had large bulk data store that got moved into bulk data and so forth. So we essentially refactored these tools into these existing stores, and then layered a set of services on top of those stores, and then built an API on top of those services. Next slide. So this next slide here should say KBase infrastructure and services, that has the yellow stack on top of the green stack on top of the cyano stack. And so you see now this model where we got these data stores, programming environment with services, and then high-level tools that start pushing more towards the biology. Layered on top of that, we have a plugin interface for extending, for users to write tools that drop into this, and we have a mechanism for plugging in more services underneath. Next slide. Building a KBase user experience. So this yellow part represents the kinds of high-level functions that sort of span the multiple domains. So we're focusing on microbes, communities, and plants, but we're doing the same kinds of thing across all three of those. We need to be able to browse and search the data that's present for those organisms. We need to build models and support engineering. We need to support model curation. We need to support experimental design. So rather than building a separate stack, a separate set of tools for each of the three domains, we're building very flexible tools that sit on top of an interface that span all of those domains. Next slide, please. This is the plugin. There's two ways to essentially add your stuff into KBase. One is to write plugins that use the API, and the other is to contribute to our services which extend the API. Next slide. And this, we can just skip over the next one. This is just how we use it to enable workflows. Skip to the next slide that has a whole list of Perl functions. So this slide here is really just to give you a gestalt that the API has many, many functions. We have an interactive environment you can log into and experiment with using the tools. Right now the API probably has around 200 functions, ranging from functions needed to annotate genomes, to curate models, to traverse the databases, and so forth. Next slide. I mentioned collaboration. The KBase team spans Argonne, Oak Ridge, Lawrence Berkeley Lab, Brookhaven National Lab, Cold Spring Harbor, number of universities, Yale, Hope College, University of Illinois, and so forth. And the core development group is about 30 developers, and so we frequently have these hackathons, build meetings. In fact, we've got one in 2 weeks, where a significant amount of the developers get together to resolve interfaces, do builds, do crosswalks of software, do deployment. So it's a big group effort. The infrastructure that we're deploying lives at 4 sites. And we did that on purpose so that we have both a distributed kind of redundant capability, but also we can leverage resources that exist at the different labs. Next slide, please. So for example, at Argonne, we have a very large sort of cloud test bed that's been converted into a production system to support KBase. It has about 12,000 cores that's running OpenStack. And a lot of our extensible backend runs on that. There's a similar version at Oak Ridge, and then there are 2 cluster systems at Berkeley and Brookhaven that provide cluster services. And we have about 3 petabytes of storage that's being managed by this collection. The way we use the cloud is in several different ways. We use it for development, of course. For KBase itself, when it's running, KBase is oriented around a service-oriented architecture, which means that the functionality behind the APIs are implemented by a set of servers that expose a set of services, and those servers, or those services that are supported by those servers, are extensible in the or elastic is probably the better word, in the sense that we can create multiple instances of those services to have more throughput capacity. So that fits well the model of a cloud, where we can create images for each of these service instances, and if we need to have, say, 20 servers running to support the annotation load, we create 20 instances of that running in the cloud. We also support some standard tool sets for data-intensive kinds of computing, MapReduce mechanisms based on Hadoop and so forth, and we also have a virtual cluster mechanism. This is working out fairly well. One of the advantages of doing it this way is we ultimately might port some aspects of this to the public cloud and shift the service model, but this is the current strategy. Next slide. I talked about the service-oriented architecture. I think you probably have a sense of what that is, but imagine a whole set of servers whose collective existence supports the API, and we have a dispatch mechanism that routes a particular call to a particular server, and load balancing mechanisms that manage that. So we have a very scalable infrastructure, and we can run instances of these servers at multiple sites, so we have redundancy. Next slide is just the service mappings. Is sort of what I just said. You know, some services run on non-virtualized hardware or managed hardware. Some is scalable in the cloud. It's a very dynamic environment.